Have you ever felt like your life is just a dress rehearsal for something real that never seems to arrive? You smile at the right times, you chase new beginnings, you sparkle in conversations, and yet deep inside there's a quiet ache like you're floating above your own existence, never fully landing. Maybe you've lived many versions of yourself, fallen in love quickly, started grand plans with fire in your chest, only to watch them fizzle into nothing. People admire your lightness, your creativity, your freedom, but no one sees a silent question that echoes in your soul. Why do I always feel unfinished? This is not just your story. It is the story of countless women who move through life like eternal girls, charming, ethereal, and endlessly searching. They live in motion but never in depth, always almost arriving but never quite becoming. This inner state has a name, Puella Eterna, the eternal maiden. Carl Jung wrote about her as the feminine counterpart to the Puella Eternus, the eternal boy. But it was Marie-Louise von Franz who revealed the haunting precision of this archetype, the woman who resists the passage of psychological time, who trades her growth for safety, her depth for charm. In this video, we're going to peel back the layers. You'll see how this archetype seduces, sabotages, and stalls your evolution. But more importantly, you'll discover that what feels like a curse may just be the beginning of your transformation. Are you ready to stop floating and finally arrive? She walks through life like a wisp of wind, light untouchable, charming in the way. Candlelight is charming, warm flickering, but never steady. On the outside, she seems radiant, full of potential, full of dreams. There's a spark in her eyes, a contagious energy, a hunger for beauty and experience. But if you look closer, beyond the surface glow, you'll see something else. A hesitancy, a refusal, a quiet fear she rarely names. She doesn't want to grow up. Not in the biological sense. She pays her bills, goes to work, makes adult decisions. But psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, she remains anchored in girlhood. She fears the crossing into true adulthood, where depth replaces novelty and choices carry weight. She flirts with possibilities but runs from permanence. She talks about freedom but avoids autonomy. She falls in love fast, deep, passionately, but always briefly. Because to stay would mean to be known, and being known feels too vulnerable, too real. Carl Jung called her the Puella Eterna, the eternal girl. She is the feminine mirror of the Puella Eternus, the eternal boy, who refuses responsibility, avoids limits, and lives in fantasy. While the Puella hides behind endless projects and possibilities, the Puella hides behind charm. She uses her lightness like armor. She smiles through uncertainty. She escapes in dreams. She wants to feel everything but hold nothing. And yet she suffers. She doesn't understand why life feels so thin, so unfinished. Why relationships don't last. Why plans don't solidify. Why even in moments of happiness, there's a strange ache behind the joy. She begins things with passion but never sees them through. She attracts people easily, but connection evaporates just as fast. She's admired but not truly seen. She's desired but not deeply loved. She is almost successful, almost in love, almost at peace. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, warned of this exact trap. She described the Puella as a woman suspended in psychological time, floating above life, disconnected from its roots, addicted to the idea of possibility, but allergic to the weight of actualization. She resists the very things that make us whole: commitment, discipline, emotional responsibility. And why? Because growing up hurts. It demands sacrifice. It demands that she lets go of her idealized image, that she grieves the illusions she's clung to for years about herself, about love, about life. Growing up means making irreversible choices. It means facing boredom, failure, imperfection. It means letting the fantasy die, and she doesn't want that. Because her fantasy has become her safe place. Her fantasy is where she doesn't have to be accountable, where she can remain forever admired, forever potential, forever untested. But here's the truth no one tells her. You cannot stay a maiden forever. Life does not wait. Time does not pause. The world around her continues to evolve even as she tries to hit replay on the same chapter. And inside, a slow erosion begins. The emptiness deepens. The disconnection grows. What once felt magical becomes fragile. What once made her glow now feels like a mask she cannot remove. There comes a moment, if she's lucky, when she sees it. A crack in the mirror, a flicker of grief, the realization that her youth has become a performance and she's exhausted from acting. And in that moment, she's faced with a choice: retreat deeper into illusion, or begin the long, honest, beautiful process of becoming real. The Puella may be seductive, but she is not sustainable. The girl must eventually die, not physically, but symbolically, so that the woman can be born. Because while the girl is enchanting, it is the woman who is whole. And wholeness, unlike fantasy, does not flicker. It holds. She didn't create the mirror she lives inside, it was handed to her. From childhood, she was taught directly or subtly that her worth lies in being lovely, that her power is in her youth, her sweetness, her ability to captivate. While boys were told to grow, build, conquer, she was told to stay soft, stay light, stay beautiful. The world applauded her smile, her spontaneity, her dreaminess, but it never asked her to lead. It never encouraged her to take up space, not with authority, but only with allure. This is not just personal conditioning, it is cultural design. We live in a society that glorifies youth and dreads maturity, a culture where aging is feared, not respected, where women are celebrated for being desired, not for being deep, where femininity is equated with charm, not sovereignty. And in that world, the eternal girl becomes a product of survival. A woman who learns that to be safe, to be loved, to be seen, she must remain adorable, unthreatening, unfinished. But there's another layer, one even deeper, more hidden, more painful. Behind the charm, beneath the spontaneity, there is often a psychic wound, an emotional injury left untreated, unspoken, unhealed. Sometimes it begins in childhood, when her emotional needs weren't met, when love was conditional, when her inner world was too big, too sensitive, too intense, and the only way to be accepted was to dim it. So she built a mask, the perfect girl. Light, agreeable, adaptable. And over time, she forgot it was a mask at all. Marie-Louise von Franz described this as the soul trapped in romanticized youth, a sterile, frozen version of life where nothing matures, nothing solidifies. It's not just a behavioral pattern, it's a defense mechanism. The Puella doesn't consciously reject maturity because she's lazy or selfish. She rejects it because the idea of growing up feels like death, the death of safety, the death of who she was praised for being. So she floats between relationships, careers, identities, always shifting, always adapting, always performing. She smiles brightly in a world that told her, be pretty, not powerful, be sweet, not strong. And she believes that if she's just good enough, beautiful enough, charming enough, someone will finally choose her, protect her, complete her. But the truth is far more sobering. No one can complete what she hasn't begun to build within. Carl Jung warned that when a woman does not face her unconscious contents, she becomes possessed by them. The Puella isn't just playing a role, she is being lived by the role. She is no longer the author of her life. She's the actress in a script written by survival, by fantasy, by fear. And what's worse, this script works. She is admired. People adore her energy, her spontaneity, her childlike wonder. But admiration is not the same as intimacy. Applause is not the same as love. And when the curtain falls, she is still alone. This is the shadow of the eternal girl, a life that looks full but feels empty. A woman who is always doing but never arriving. Who is visible everywhere but unknown to herself. Who performs lightness to avoid the sacred weight of becoming real. So where does the healing begin? It begins with the painful recognition that the culture was wrong. That youth is not the pinnacle. That depth is not a flaw. That being a woman is not about remaining a girl forever. Healing begins when she no longer fears the mirror cracking, but welcomes it because finally she is ready to see what lies beyond the image, beyond charm, beyond perfection, beyond performance. She is ready to meet herself, and that meeting, that honest, trembling, courageous confrontation, is where the journey toward true womanhood begins. At first glance, she's magnetic. She radiates possibility like the promise of a new chapter waiting to be written. People are drawn to her energy, the way she moves through life with effortless grace, the way she dreams aloud, the way she seems untouched by cynicism. She makes everything feel exciting, enchanted, alive. But stay long enough and the shimmer fades. Because while the Puella Eterna lights up every room she enters, she rarely stays long enough to turn that light into warmth. She is everywhere and nowhere, always arriving, never rooted. She starts things, relationships, projects, paths, but they rarely hold. She chases intensity but recoils from endurance. What looks like freedom is often evasion. What feels like magic is often ungrounded motion. And eventually the cracks begin to show. There's a specific kind of sorrow that creeps into her life, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and persistent. It sounds like, why does this always happen to me? It feels like staring at a wall of half-finished dreams and asking, what am I doing wrong? It looks like always being busy, but never feeling accomplished. Like collecting lovers, plans, and passions, but never knowing who you really are beneath them. Marie-Louise von Franz warned that the Puella archetype leads to a life of emotional repetition, where patterns don't evolve, they repeat. Relationships follow the same script: intense beginnings, idealization, then collapse. Careers feel exciting at first, but the moment structure is required, she flees. Responsibility feels suffocating. Consistency feels like confinement. And so she floats from thing to thing, convinced that the next one will be the one that finally makes sense. But it never does. Because the issue isn't what she's doing, it's what she's avoiding. She avoids the very ingredients of a full life commitment: presence, follow-through. She fears boredom because it feels like death. She fears intimacy because it threatens her mask. She fears decision because it means letting go of all the other what-ifs that she keeps like secret treasures in the back of her mind. And the most painful part, she is often admired for it. People say, you're so vibrant, you're so spontaneous, I wish I had your freedom. But what they don't see is the emotional exhaustion behind the performance. They don't see the gnawing ache of incompletion. They don't see the woman who is tired of being fascinating and longs to be known instead. Over time, the archetype that once protected her becomes a prison. What began as charm becomes a cage. Her identity, so tied to being young, dreamy, untethered, starts to feel fragile. She becomes terrified of aging, not just because of wrinkles or time, but because aging threatens her illusion. If she's no longer the captivating girl who is she, without growth, there is only stagnation masked by movement. And behind the constant change, there is a soul quietly unraveling. Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The Puella doesn't realize that she is being lived by the archetype. She thinks she's making choices, but in truth, the avoidance is choosing for her. The fantasy is driving her. And the longer she stays in that cycle, the more life passes her by beautifully packaged, but deeply unfulfilled. But even in this darkness, a question begins to form. What if I stayed? What if I stopped running? What if I chose something not because it's perfect, but because I am ready? This is the beginning of awakening. Not the end of beauty, but the start of depth. Not the loss of magic, but the discovery of meaning. Not the death of the girl, but the birth of the woman. Every story of transformation begins with loss. Not the loss of something external, but the kind that happens deep inside, the letting go of an identity that once kept you safe, but now keeps you small. For the woman trapped in the Puella Eterna archetype, this loss is terrifying. Because the girl she has been, the light one, the lovely one, the free-spirited one, is not just who she pretended to be. For a long time, it was who she believed she was. And so when the moment comes to grow, to step into something larger, more rooted, more real, it feels like a kind of death. Not physical death, but a symbolic death, the death of the eternal girl, the dreamer who refused to choose, who floated above the weight of reality. This death is essential. It's what Carl Jung described as the necessary passage of individuation, the process of becoming whole. In every true transformation, something must be left behind. And for the Puella, it is the fantasy that must die. The fantasy of being rescued. The fantasy of perfect love. The fantasy that freedom means never having to stay. Marie-Louise von Franz was clear: the woman who refuses to let the maiden archetype die cannot be reborn as a complete woman. She remains fragmented, half real, half illusion. She exists in emotional limbo, forever circling around maturity, but never entering it. And eventually the weight of this refusal becomes unbearable. The mask starts to crack. The performance begins to exhaust her. The applause no longer nourishes her. She no longer wants to be the girl who enchants. She wants to be the woman who is. This is where the queen within begins to stir. The queen is not a role. She is not an attitude. She is not about control, pride, or dominance. The queen is a symbol of inner sovereignty, a woman who is rooted in herself, who no longer needs to be chosen because she has already chosen herself. She is capable of stillness, of responsibility, of presence. She does not fear the mirror or the clock or the silence because she has built a home inside her own soul. Unlike the maiden who waits to be adored, the queen commands respect. Unlike the maiden who dreams of being seen, the queen sees herself. She no longer performs her worth, she embodies it. This transition is not easy. In fact, it may be the most painful sacred threshold a woman will ever cross. It means grieving the girl, thanking her for all the ways she helped you survive, then gently laying her to rest. It means turning inward and facing what you've avoided, the truth of your desires, the weight of your choices, the depth of your fears. It means growing roots where before there was only flight. But in this sacred unraveling, something extraordinary happens. You begin to feel whole. Not because you've perfected yourself, but because you've embraced your fullness, your light and your shadow, your tenderness and your strength, your longing and your boundaries. You stop waiting for someone to crown you. You place the crown upon your own head, not out of arrogance, but out of reverence for the woman you are becoming. The world doesn't need more charming girls. It needs sovereign women who are not afraid of depth or time or truth. Women who walk with purpose. Women who stay. Women who no longer shrink to be liked, but expand to be real. And here's the paradox: the moment you let the girl die, your radiance does not vanish, it transforms. It becomes quieter, deeper, more magnetic. It stops being a spark and becomes a steady flame. The journey from maiden to queen is not the end of beauty, it is the beginning of power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that anchors. Not the kind that captivates, but the kind that commands. And that power was always yours. There comes a moment when the fantasy begins to unravel. Not with thunder, not with tragedy, but in quiet, honest moments, standing in your own kitchen, staring into the mirror, realizing you don't know who you are beneath the versions you've performed. The life of the eternal girl, once thrilling and full of promise, begins to feel hollow. Like a carousel ride you can't get off. The music plays, the lights flash, but you're going in circles. And something inside you, something ancient, something real starts to whisper, "This isn't it. This isn't who I'm meant to be." This whisper is the call of individuation. Carl Jung described individuation as the lifelong journey of becoming your true self, not the self shaped by fear, fantasy, or cultural expectations, but the self that arises from within. It is the process of integrating all that has been exiled, your shadow, your strength, your sovereignty. And for the woman caught in the Puella Eterna, this path is both a confrontation and a liberation. Because the Puella lives in a loop of new beginnings, she is always preparing, never arriving. She dreams of a perfect partner, a perfect career, a perfect moment to begin her real life. But nothing real ever comes from dreams alone. To live fully, she must descend into responsibility, into choice, into the ordinary beauty of what is. This descent is painful. It means releasing the belief that life must always feel magical, that freedom is found in escape, that happiness comes from being adored. It means facing the deep, terrifying truth that no one is coming to save you. Not a man, not a job, not a fantasy. And it's in this surrender, this quiet reckoning, that something unexpected begins to emerge. True freedom, not the freedom to run, the freedom to stay, not the freedom to please, the freedom to be real, not the freedom to drift, the freedom to root. This kind of freedom doesn't glitter. It doesn't come wrapped in romantic promises. It comes with solitude, with boundaries, with silence. It asks you to stop performing, to stop apologizing, to stop shrinking into sweetness so others won't feel threatened by your power. It asks you to step into your own authority, not to dominate, but to stand. And here lies the most painful paradox for the Puella. What she feared most, structure, maturity, depth, is exactly what she was longing for all along. She didn't need endless options. She needed inner orientation. She didn't need to be pursued. She needed to pursue herself. She didn't need to be rescued. She needed to awaken. Emma Jung once said that if a woman does not integrate the animus, the masculine principle within, she remains dependent, fragmented, and swayed by unconscious forces. For the Puella, this integration is crucial. It's the shift from fantasy to foundation, from speech to action, from someday to now. And when this integration begins, so does a new identity. Not as the adored girl, but as the rooted woman. She no longer runs from decisions, she makes them. She no longer avoids silence, she listens. She no longer waits to be chosen, she chooses. This is the sacred work of individuation. It is not glamorous. It will not make you universally liked. It will cost you comfort, illusions, and maybe even the identity you've used to survive. But what it gives you in return is priceless yourself, a self that is grounded, a self that can hold contradiction, a self that does not vanish when love leaves or seasons change. Because the woman who has individuated doesn't need constant affirmation, she is rooted in her own truth. She is not trying to be everything. She is content to be exactly who she is. And that is the beginning of everything. The tragedy of the Puella Eterna is not that she lacks potential, it's that she never brings that potential to life. At her core, she is brilliant, magnetic, full of untapped gifts. She begins with fire, intensity, passion, vision. But like a match struck in the wind, her flame rarely lasts. Because underneath the beauty, underneath the movement, there is a silent saboteur, the refusal to stay. In relationships, the cycle is almost predictable. It starts with enchantment. She idealizes the other person, projecting onto them the missing pieces of herself. Emotional depth, groundedness, the safety she craves. She becomes intoxicated with the fantasy of perfect connection, soul-level fusion, unspoken understanding. In these early moments, everything feels divine, romantic, fated. But then reality arrives. The other person makes a mistake, has needs, is human, and suddenly the spell is broken. She says it's not the same anymore or something's changed, but what's really changed is her illusion. She wasn't in love with the person, she was in love with the image, with what they represented, with what she hoped they could rescue in her. And when they fail to deliver the salvation she secretly longed for, she pulls away, withdraws, escapes. She either clings with desperation or flees with silence. And the relationship ends not with truth, but with confusion. In career, the same pattern emerges. She seeks inspiration, not structure, meaning not mastery. She wants to feel alive in her work, but the moment things become routine, demanding, or grounded in responsibility, she grows restless. She starts new projects with excitement but rarely finishes them. She tells herself she's still searching for alignment or waiting for the right fit, but deep down she is running from discipline, from boredom, from the challenge of sustaining something meaningful. And in doing so, she sabotages her own gifts. She is capable of greatness, but greatness requires roots, requires repetition, requires failure. And the Puella cannot bear the vulnerability of showing up when she no longer feels enchanted. She wants her expression to be effortless. But all real creation, all true mastery, lives beyond the honeymoon stage. Then there is the matter of identity, the most sacred sabotage of all. Because the Puella never fully lands in herself. She tries on roles like costumes, the creative, the empath, the free spirit, the muse. But behind the glitter is a quiet ache. Who am I without the performance? She fears that if she stops dazzling, she will disappear. And that fear is valid because she has built her sense of self on how others see her, not on how deeply she knows herself. Her self-worth is externally referenced. She is what others reflect back to her. So when admiration fades, she crumbles, because the image is all she has. Carl Jung wrote that when we avoid our inner work, our unconscious will find ways to live through us. And that's what's happening here. The Puella is not choosing this cycle, it's choosing her. It's living through her, shaping her choices, steering her away from the very things she longs for. Most real intimacy, meaningful purpose, authentic identity. But here's the grace in all of it. The moment she sees the pattern is the moment she begins to break it. When she can look at her relationships and ask, what am I avoiding? When she can sit with her unfinished projects and ask what part of me is afraid to be seen. When she can strip off the mask and whisper, I am willing to meet the woman beneath the image, that is when everything begins to shift. The cycle ends not through force, but through awareness. Not through shame, but through radical honesty. And when she chooses presence over performance, she will finally begin to live. Not as a character, not as a symbol, but as herself. She enchants. The Puella Eterna walks into a room and draws attention, not always through beauty, but through energy. Something in her feels ethereal light, almost otherworldly. People are magnetized by her unpredictability, her laughter, the way she seems to float above the mundane. She is the embodiment of spontaneity, sensitivity, dream. But what they don't see, what she often doesn't even recognize, is that beneath this luminescence lies a profound and aching void. This void doesn't scream. It doesn't cause public chaos. It whispers in moments of stillness. It shows up when the party ends, when the screen turns off, when the person she projected all her longing onto walks away, and she is left alone staring at herself without the performance. Behind the smiles, behind the soft voice and effortless charm, lives a deeply wounded girl. A girl who once believed that if she could just be lovely enough, she would finally be loved. If she could sparkle brightly enough, someone would notice her pain and hold her through it. And so she crafted an identity based on being desirable, agreeable light. But over time, that identity became a prison. Emma Jung, in her reflections on the feminine psyche, described the danger of disowning one's inner contents. When a woman refuses to face her own needs, wounds and darkness, she becomes consumed by them unconsciously, projecting them onto others, hoping someone else will carry what she cannot bear. This is the hidden tragedy of the Puella she is performing herself. She has become the actress and the audience of her own life, caught in a loop of expression and observation. She speaks with softness, not always because she is gentle, but because she is afraid. Afraid to be rejected, afraid to confront, afraid to take up space. She avoids conflict not from wisdom, but from a paralyzing fear of being unloved. She hesitates to lead not because she lacks intelligence, but because somewhere inside she still believes that being chosen is safer than choosing herself. And that belief is exhausting. It leads her to relationships where she waits to be validated, where she molds herself into what the other person wants, hoping it will earn her the love she never learned to give herself. But inevitably it fails, because the foundation is built on illusion, not truth, on fear, not wholeness. Even her kindness at times becomes strategy. She listens intently, not always from empathy, but because being the good girl has become her currency. Her worth is tied to her ability to be pleasing, palatable, undemanding, and so she lives disconnected from her own rage, her own boundaries, her own power. She doesn't know how to say no. She doesn't know how to disappoint. She doesn't know how to stand in a room and say, "This is who I am, whether you like it or not." And this disconnection from authenticity, from inner authority, is where the real suffering lies. Because deep down, she knows this version of herself is not the whole story. It's a role, a mask, a survival pattern. And one day it begins to crack, usually not through crisis, but through fatigue, through that moment when she wakes up and feels emotionally bankrupt, when no amount of praise, romance, or attention can quiet the emptiness growing inside. When she realizes that she's surrounded by people, but no one really knows her, not even herself. That moment, while painful, is sacred. It is the beginning of something true, the unraveling of the false self, the confrontation with the wounds she spent years decorating. It is a call not to become someone else, but to return to the self she abandoned, the woman beneath the enchantment, the soul behind the strategy. And from that return, healing begins. Not by adding more glitter, but by sitting in the silence. Not by chasing more admiration, but by choosing self-respect. Not by perfecting the persona, but by laying it down. The Puella doesn't need more lightness. She needs depth. She needs truth. She needs the courage to stop being adored and start being real. Because that is where the pain ends and the woman begins. Time doesn't wait. It moves steadily, quietly, with no regard for our fantasies. And for the woman trapped in the Puella Eterna archetype, this is perhaps the most terrifying truth of all, that the clock is always ticking, and that youth, no matter how beautifully preserved, cannot be lived on forever. She has spent so much of her life trying to delay the inevitable. In her heart, time is not a passage, it's a threat. She avoids mirrors not because she fears aging itself, but because she fears what aging represents: the end of the girl, the death of possibility, the undeniable arrival of life's deeper responsibilities. In a culture that celebrates endless youth, this fear is validated everywhere she turns. The beauty industry profits off it. Social media thrives on it. Women are praised for looking young, acting young, staying young, as if being youthful is not just an aesthetic, but a moral virtue. As if becoming older, wiser, fuller, more rooted were something to hide, not honor. But time in its quiet way insists. And eventually the woman who has avoided growing up must face the one truth she cannot outrun, that real freedom isn't found in remaining uncommitted, it is found in learning to stay. Staying is terrifying when all you've known is movement. Choosing is painful when you've been addicted to possibility. But nothing grows in the soil of maybe. You cannot build a life when every path is kept open, every decision postponed, every version of yourself preserved just in case. True maturity begins when you say, I choose this. Not because it's perfect, not because it promises eternal excitement, but because you're ready to participate fully in your own existence, not as a guest, not as a child, but as the woman at the center of her own life. And this requires commitment. Commitment to yourself, commitment to your values, commitment to something larger than your fleeting moods. It might be a relationship, a vocation, a spiritual path, a home. But what matters most is not the object of your commitment, it's your willingness to plant roots. The Puella fears this. She believes that commitment equals confinement, that to choose something is to lose everything else. But what she doesn't yet understand is that freedom without direction is emptiness, that endless options don't make you powerful, they make you untethered, that the refusal to choose is not liberation, it is paralysis dressed as possibility. Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz both wrote that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires sacrifice. And what must be sacrificed is not love or beauty or joy. What must die is the fantasy, the illusion that life can be lived without loss, without effort, without gravity. When the woman begins to choose with consciousness, her life changes. She stops performing and begins participating. She no longer needs to be desired, she desires herself. She no longer looks for permission, she grants it. She no longer floats above life, she steps into it, body and soul. And here's the paradox, the moment she truly commits, she doesn't feel trapped. She feels anchored. She discovers that the stability she once feared is the very ground from which her deepest power can rise. She stops waiting for a perfect life and begins creating a meaningful one. The woman who grows up is not boring. She is not bitter. She is not less radiant. She is real. She is luminous in her clarity. She is magnetic in her rootedness. And unlike the eternal girl, she does not fear time. She walks with it. She does not beg life to slow down, she meets it with open hands. Because maturity is not the end of wonder, it is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom, unlike fantasy, will never abandon her. If there's one truth we can all take from the story of the Puella Eterna, it's this: you cannot build a meaningful life while floating above it. Dreams are beautiful, but they are not homes. Possibility is exciting, but it is not a substitute for purpose. Eventually, we must come down from the clouds, not because we've lost our magic, but because it's time to root that magic into something real. The lesson here is not to shame the part of you that longs for freedom, love, or enchantment. That part of you is sacred. But freedom without direction leads to chaos. Love without self-awareness leads to patterns. And enchantment without grounding leads to illusion. What this archetype teaches us is that maturity is not a burden, it's a form of power. Saying yes to something yourself, your truth, your path is not weakness. It's the beginning of embodiment. It's where healing begins, where authenticity emerges, where your life becomes yours. So if you've been waiting for a sign to stop running, to stop performing, to finally show up, this is it. Let the girl within you rest. Thank her. Then rise as the woman you were always meant to be. Because becoming whole isn't the end of wonder, it's the start of a different kind of magic, one that lasts.